A battered photo of a soldier in a hospital bed, covered in bandages and bruises, once sat on a small table in a Texas living room. Anyone who glanced at it might have felt an initial jolt of shock at the man's injuries, but then they would have noticed something far more striking: the quiet determination in his eyes, as if even in such dire straits he was planning his next move. That man was Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez, whose extraordinary actions in the jungles of Vietnam would eventually be recognized as among the most awe-inspiring feats of valor in modern military history. Yet for all the acclaim he garnered later, it is easy to forget that he was once simply a humble farm boy who spent much of his childhood alone on dusty fields, battling poverty and prejudice with the same steely resolve he would later demonstrate on the battlefield. His journey from orphaned laborer to Special Forces legend reveals a person who embodied the highest ideals of service and sacrifice, and who bore the emotional scars of war for the rest of his life. To understand how Roy Benavidez reached that defining moment, when he jumped from a helicopter into a hailstorm of gunfire to save a dozen fellow soldiers, one must look first at the historical and cultural backdrop of his upbringing. He was born on August 5, 1935, near Cuero, Texas, a region characterized by its tough farmland and an even tougher social hierarchy. Roy's early life was fraught with personal tragedies that would have derailed many. His father, Salvador, died of tuberculosis when Roy was only 2 years old. His mother, Teresa, died shortly afterward. Left effectively orphaned, Roy and his younger brother were taken in by extended family, but the household was far from stable. He found what solace he could in the fields, picking cotton or clearing sugar beets under the blistering Texas sun. This work taught him the merits of grit, perseverance, and a will to survive, traits he would need later when his life depended on ignoring pain, fatigue, and fear. Still, despite his toughness, Roy's childhood was marked by an undercurrent of loneliness. Various friends and neighbors recalled him as a quiet boy, often keeping his feelings guarded. One family acquaintance remembered him as the one who would do chores without being told, never complaining, never letting on if the burden was too heavy. In these formative years, he learned to rely on inner resolve, a trait that shaped his character and guided him toward the Army. By the time Roy was a teenager, the nation had undergone seismic changes. World War II had come and gone, leaving the United States a global superpower even as it faced new tensions, particularly with the Soviet Union. For families like Roy's, the end of one war meant the beginning of a new kind of struggle, forging a place in a rapidly evolving society. The post-war economic boom did little for impoverished farm workers in rural Texas, and Roy found himself drifting. He dropped out of school in the 7th grade, partly to help support his relatives. As he grew older, he realized that enlisting in the military might offer him not just a paycheck, but also a path away from the prejudices that kept him on the sidelines. At 19, he joined the Army National Guard, eventually transitioning to active duty in the United States Army in 1955. The sense of belonging he found there, uniforms, drills, shared hardship, filled a void that had been present for most of his life. In many ways, this step represented a chance for Roy to channel all he had learned about perseverance into a concrete vocation. During his early Army training, he encountered discrimination from some fellow recruits who dismissed him for his ethnicity and his lack of formal education. But Roy, consistent with the quiet determination of his youth, let his work ethic do the talking. He rose before dawn to drill on his own, practiced marching and marksmanship after hours, and eventually caught the attention of mentors who saw potential in him. One of his commanding officers many years later recalled, "He was never the loudest guy in the barracks, but you knew he was there because everything was done perfectly, on time, and without complaint. This pattern of self-discipline culminated in his eventual selection for Special Forces, the famed Green Berets. If the Army shaped his sense of order and belonging, Special Forces training refined his innate resilience, demanding a mental toughness that few possessed. Roy's road to Special Forces was not smooth. In 1965, while serving in Vietnam, he stepped on a landmine. The explosion left him with severe leg injuries and partial paralysis. Doctors told him he might never walk again. For an ordinary soldier, such news might have signaled the end of a career, perhaps even the end of a meaningful life outside of a wheelchair. But Roy refused to accept that fate. Stationed in Fort Sam Houston for rehabilitation, he would drag himself out of bed at night, navigating the hospital corridors with his arms or a walker, pushing his body to the brink of agony to regain the use of his legs. Though physically isolated in that lonely recovery ward, he was determined to fight in silence, as he always had. He prayed, tested his limits, and, through excruciating pain, forced himself first to stand, then to shuffle, then to walk. Within a year, he had astounded the medical staff by returning to near full physical fitness. In a later interview, Roy reflected on that period with tears in his eyes. I told myself, this is not it. I have more to give. I couldn't stand by and watch my brothers over there fighting while I stayed in bed. That unwavering resolve would soon catapult him into a defining moment of raw heroism. That moment came on May 2nd, 1968, while Roy was back in Vietnam, serving with the 5th Special Forces Group, Airborne, Detachment B-56, in the Clandestine Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG. Intelligence indicated that a 12-man Special Forces reconnaissance team had been dropped behind enemy lines in Cambodia, only to find itself surrounded by a large North Vietnamese Army, NVA force. Trapped and under intense fire, the team's radio transmissions indicated that casualties were mounting rapidly and that if rescue did not arrive soon, none would survive. Roy, stationed at a forward base, overheard the frantic messages and volunteered on the spot to join the rescue helicopter. Without time to properly equip himself, he didn't even bring a rifle. He boarded the helicopter wearing only his fatigues, boots, and a medical aid bag. Years later, when asked about that decision, he simply said, "They were my friends, and they needed help. That's all I needed to know." What transpired over the next 6 hours became the stuff of legend. As soon as the helicopter reached the landing zone, it came under withering machine gun and rocket-propelled grenade fire. The pilot managed to hover briefly, and Roy leapt onto the ground, sprinting through a hail of bullets to reach the wounded men. He was immediately shot in the leg, the bullet tearing flesh and muscle. Undeterred, he crawled to the nearest soldier and began administering life-saving aid. One eyewitness account described Roy weaving between fallen comrades, dragging them to relative cover, offering words of encouragement. "Hang on, brother. We're going home." Even as more bullets found him, he was shot in the face, the abdomen, and numerous other places. Roy refused to back down. He gathered weapons from the dead and wounded, returning fire while simultaneously applying tourniquets to those who could not help themselves. 2 more helicopters attempted landings, only to be driven away or forced down by enemy fire. At one point, a North Vietnamese soldier lunged at Roy with a bayonet, slashing his arm. Roy fought him off with his bare hands, eventually killing him. Throughout this firefight, Roy organized a perimeter of the wounded, focusing on surviving the relentless onslaught until rescue helicopters could land. Over the radio, he shouted for air support, gave coordinates, and guided in gunships that strafed the enemy positions, buying precious minutes. When a helicopter finally made it to the ground without being destroyed, Roy dragged the wounded men aboard, ignoring his own worsening condition. As he ran to retrieve the last few stragglers, shrapnel from a grenade tore into his back, and he collapsed. Adrenaline flooding his veins, he dragged himself upright, grabbed a dazed comrade, and heaved him onto the waiting chopper. Only then did he haul himself inside. As the helicopter lifted off, Roy collapsed onto the floor, covered in blood, drifting in and out of consciousness. He would later be counted as having sustained 37 separate bullet, bayonet, and shrapnel wounds. In the immediate aftermath of that brutal mission, Roy was presumed dead. A medical officer began zipping him into a body bag before Roy managed to spit blood onto the man's face, his only way of indicating he was still alive. He was rushed to a field hospital and eventually evacuated, enduring months of agonizing recovery. The soldiers he rescued, many of whom might not have lived another hour without his intervention, credited him personally for their survival. One of them, Staff Sergeant Lloyd "Frenchy" Musso, later testified, "I owe every sunrise to Benavidez. There was never a doubt in my mind that if he hadn't come, we'd have all died." Reports of Roy's actions filtered back to command, prompting an immediate nomination for the Distinguished Service Cross, which he received from General William Westmoreland in 1969. Yet some believe the recognition fell short of the magnitude of his bravery, and they began pushing for the Medal of Honor. Years of bureaucratic inertia and lost paperwork stalled the process. It wasn't until 1981 that President Ronald Reagan finally presented Roy with the Medal of Honor, famously remarking that if the story of his heroism were a movie script, no one would believe it. Behind the valiant deeds and citations, Roy's personal life was a tapestry of both profound love and quiet suffering. While stationed at Fort Bragg, he met and married Hilaria Lala Coy, who stood by him through the darkest phases of his recovery. Their relationship was a lifeline of stability, a gentle counterpoint to the violence and chaos of war. Letters between them, preserved by family members, reveal a depth of feeling rarely seen in stoic military circles. In one letter, Lala wrote, "Every day I pray for your safe return. I know your duty calls you away, but my arms ache for you." Roy's responses, though brief, expressed equal devotion and gratitude, mentioning that her love was the light that leads me home. They raised 3 children together, with Roy balancing the demands of a military career and fatherhood as best he could. Yet the mental toll of his experiences was evident. His children remembered a father who sometimes woke from nightmares, drenched in sweat and calling out orders, as if still on the battlefield. He struggled with survivor's guilt, a condition common among veterans who outlived their comrades. The numerous physical injuries also left him with chronic pain, which at times frayed his patience and emotional well-being. Nevertheless, he refused to let those burdens overshadow his role as husband and father. He became known in his community for visiting local schools to speak to students, advocating education and perseverance. One teacher recalled, he told the children, "You can do anything, just don't quit. I never quit, and it saved my life and the lives of others." Despite his near-mythical status among soldiers, Roy was not insulated from the controversies swirling around the Vietnam War. Many Americans questioned the moral and strategic rationale behind the conflict, arguing that it was an unwinnable quagmire, costing countless lives on both sides. Protests erupted across the country, with some activists denouncing returning soldiers as participants in an unjust war. Even though Roy's personal heroism was largely beyond reproach, he could not escape the polarizing atmosphere. In a rare public statement on the war's politics, he once said, "I did not choose the war. I chose to help my brothers who were fighting in it. I can live with that decision." Some critics interpreted his words as tacit endorsement of U.S. policy, while others saw them as a humble refusal to judge the morality of a conflict he had little control over. Historians have since debated the ethics of U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia, raising questions about whether the bloodshed could have been mitigated through diplomacy. Roy's personal story has often been overshadowed by these larger discussions, leaving him in the complex position of being hailed as a hero while also serving as a symbol of a divisive and traumatizing war. Another point of contention revolves around the long delay in granting Roy the Medal of Honor. Some have alleged that systemic biases, perhaps racial, perhaps bureaucratic, slowed the process. Others argue that it was simply a matter of collecting adequate eyewitness accounts from a mission that was top secret. Make v. SOG missions were highly classified, and many of the official records were incomplete or sealed. Over time, historians have come to accept that a combination of secrecy, administrative inefficiency, and the chaotic nature of combat in Vietnam likely caused the delay. However, the incident underscores how easily extraordinary valor can be lost in the labyrinth of military paperwork. Many remain convinced that Roy's unwavering courage deserved immediate recognition. For Roy himself, the eventual bestowal of the Medal of Honor seemed less about personal glory and more about honoring those who had fought and fallen around him. He once remarked, "This medal is for the real heroes, the ones who didn't come back." Regardless of the controversies, Roy's actions had significant ramifications, both for the Special Forces community and for how the broader American public perceived individual acts of heroism during a widely unpopular war. Strategically, the success of that rescue mission in 1968 saved several highly trained reconnaissance specialists, enabling them to continue vital intelligence operations. Though one small incident in an expansive theater, the survival of those few men arguably impacted the local balance of power in the area, as they returned to gather further intelligence about NVA movements. He spent his final years battling diabetes and other complications stemming from his war injuries. Even from his hospital bed, he was known to shake a visitor's hand firmly and deliver a motivational word or two. As his health deteriorated, tributes began pouring in from veterans groups, political leaders, and ordinary citizens who found in Roy's life a potent reminder of the human capacity for resilience and goodwill. On November 29, 1998, at the age of 63, Roy Benavidez died at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. By then, his legend had taken shape, not merely as a story of one heroic mission, but as a testament to a lifelong refusal to surrender, whether to bigotry, physical injury, or the despair that war often leaves in its wake. That's all for today's video. Don't forget to leave a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe so you'll always be in the loop. Thanks for watching,